The park was calm that evening, children laughing, families relaxing, joggers passing by, until the piercing sound of a police siren shattered the peace. All eyes turned toward a scene no one wanted to believe. An elderly black woman, her gray hair shining in the fading sunlight, trembling as she leaned on her cane. A white police officer had her arm twisted in his grip, treating her as if she were a dangerous criminal. "Stop! She's just an old woman," someone shouted, their voice cracking with fear and anger. But the officer's hand only tightened. Phones shot up recording. Children cried. A heavy silence fell over the crowd, the kind that comes when people know they're witnessing something terribly wrong. "Why does this always happen?" Another voice muttered bitterly. Injustice hung in the air, thick and suffocating. And then, through the crowd, came a figure that shifted everything. Broad shoulders, bald head gleaming in the evening light. A presence so powerful that people instantly stepped back to make way. When the crowd realized who it was, the atmosphere changed. This wasn't just anyone. This was Mike Tyson. The officer still held onto the frail, old woman's arm. But the story was about to take a turn no one would ever forget. Her name was Mrs. Eleanor Johnson, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for most of her life. She wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, but to the people around her, she was family. Children she once taught still visited her, bringing flowers on Teacher's Day. Neighbors relied on her for advice, and anyone who spoke with her remembered her kindness. Eleanor was the kind of woman who still gave candy to kids on Halloween, who donated what little she had to the local church, who sat with lonely widows just so they wouldn't feel forgotten. But beneath that gentle presence was a history of resilience. Eleanor had grown up in a world that wasn't kind to women like her. In the 1960s, she had marched in civil rights protests, facing tear gas, slurs, and hatred. She remembered being pushed by officers, shouted at by strangers, and standing shoulder to shoulder with others demanding dignity. Those scars had never truly faded, but she carried them with quiet strength. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor was simply walking home from the grocery store. A bag full of bread and apples dangled from one hand, her cane in the other. She stopped in the park to rest her tired legs. Families picnicked nearby, kids threw frisbees, the smell of roasted peanuts drifted through the air. It was a scene of peace, or at least it should have been. That was when the officer appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an expression that seemed impatient from the moment he spotted her. "Ma'am, what are you doing here?" he barked. Eleanor, startled but polite, replied, "Just resting, officer. These legs aren't what they used to be." She gave a small smile, hoping to defuse the tension. But the officer's gaze hardened. "Identification," he demanded. Her heart sank. She had left her ID at home, something she'd done countless times when just walking to the corner store. "I don't have it on me," she admitted. The officer's voice grew sharper. "Then you can't sit here. Move along. You're loitering." The word cut deep. Loitering? She was 72 years old, carrying groceries, barely able to stand for long. Was it a crime to rest her legs? "I've done nothing wrong," Eleanor said softly but firmly. "I'll head home soon." That was when his patience snapped. With a scowl, he grabbed her arm. The bag of groceries slipped from her hand, apples rolling across the pavement. Gasps rose from the crowd. Phones came out. Parents pulled their children closer. A murmur spread. No one could believe what they were seeing. But Eleanor wasn't shocked. She had seen this before. Different decade, different uniform, but the same cruelty. Her eyes filled with tears, not just from pain, but from the bitter realization that after all these years, nothing had really changed. And then from the edge of the park, a shadow moved closer. Broad shoulders, bald head, a presence that carried both power and history. The man who had terrified opponents in the boxing ring now walked with quiet fury. It was Mike Tyson, and what he was about to do would turn this ordinary afternoon into a moment the world would never forget. The crowd's whispers grew louder. Some pulled out their phones, others looked around helplessly, debating if they should interfere. But deep down, many were afraid. No one wanted to be the one to step between a police officer and his target. Eleanor's groceries lay scattered across the ground, apples rolling under benches, bread crushed beneath careless feet. She winced as the officer's grip tightened on her fragile wrist. "Please," she whispered, "you're hurting me." But her plea only seemed to fuel him. "Stop resisting," he barked, though she was barely standing, her cane shaking beside her. The injustice was unbearable to watch. A young man in the crowd muttered bitterly, "This is how it always starts. They pick on the weak." Another shouted, "Leave her alone." But no one moved. It was as if an invisible wall of fear held them back. Then, cutting through the tension, came the heavy footsteps of Mike Tyson. At first, a few recognized him, their voices hushed with disbelief. That's Mike Tyson," one whispered. The words rippled through the crowd. Heads turned. Cameras zoomed in. A legend had just stepped into the frame. Mike's face was carved with anger. He had lived a life where violence and misunderstanding often walked hand in hand with his name. He knew what power abused looked like. He knew the taste of humiliation. And now, watching a 72-year-old woman being manhandled, something inside him snapped. He stepped forward, voice booming but controlled. "Let her go." The officer froze for a moment, startled by the intensity in Mike's tone. But pride and authority don't bend easily. He sneered, "Step back, sir. This doesn't concern you." The crowd erupted. "It does concern him," one shouted. "She's innocent." Eleanor trembled, clutching her cane, eyes darting between the officer and the man now standing in her defense. She recognized him instantly. Even in her fear, a spark of relief crossed her face. Mike Tyson was on her side. But the officer doubled down. He jerked her arm again, harder this time, nearly pulling her off her feet. Eleanor cried out in pain. That sound cut through Mike like a blade. In a flash, Mike's hand shot out, grabbing the officer's wrist before Eleanor could fall. Gasps filled the air. The once silent crowd now roared, cheering, clapping, recording every second. "Don't you dare lay another hand on her," Mike growled, his voice low but shaking with fury. The officer tried to pull free, but it was useless. Mike's grip was like steel. Years of training, power, and discipline surged through his arm. The officer's bravado faltered as he realized who he was up against. Not just a man, but a legend whose very name commanded fear. Still, arrogance pushed him to bark. "You're interfering with police business. You'll be arrested." But no one believed him. Not with the cameras rolling, not with the truth so clear. The crowd shouted louder. "Shame on you. Let her go. Protect her, Mike." Eleanor, still shaking, whispered hoarsely, "Please don't fight because of me. Just let me go home." But the moment was no longer just about Eleanor. This was about every time someone had watched helplessly as injustice unfolded. This was about every elderly woman, every powerless man, every child taught to lower their eyes instead of raising their voice. Mike knew it too. His jaw clenched. His eyes blazed. "You think your badge give you the right to hurt her?" he thundered. "Not today." The officer's face reddened, his authority crumbling as the crowd rallied behind Mike. The tension in the air was electric, every second stretching longer than the last. Phones shook as people tried to capture the scene, knowing the world would soon see what they were witnessing. Some chanted Mike's name. Others shouted at the officer to back down. And in that charged silence, Mike Tyson stood unmovable, a wall between brutality and innocence, daring the officer to try one more time. The stage was set. The next moment would decide everything. The officer's pride was burning hotter than reason. He yanked against Mike's grip, his voice cracking as he shouted, "You're assaulting an officer. Let go." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Dozens of cameras pointed straight at him. Every ugly detail, his twisted expression, his rough hands on a frail old woman, was being broadcast to the world in real time. Mike didn't move. His eyes locked on the officers, a storm of fury and control. "You call this law enforcement?" he growled. "She's somebody's grandmother." The crowd erupted. "Let her go," they chanted. Some stepped closer, forming a semicircle around the officer. The authority he had worn like armor only minutes ago was now crumbling under the weight of public judgment. Eleanor's legs buckled, and she nearly collapsed. Mike caught her with one hand, steadying her, while still gripping the officer with the other. His strength, his composure. It was a picture of power used for protection, not harm. The officer's face turned pale. He tried to bark orders at the crowd, but his words drowned beneath their shouts. Justice for her. Shame. Protect our elders. The chants grew louder, shaking the air. And then, with one final tug, Mike wrenched the officer's arm free from Eleanor. Gasps turned into thunderous cheers. The old woman stumbled back into a safe embrace, her cane rattling as tears streaked her cheeks. "You will not touch her again," Mike said, each word sharp as a blade. His voice was low, deliberate, more terrifying than a scream. The officer froze. Backup sirens wailed in the distance, but it no longer mattered. He wasn't in control anymore. The crowd surged forward, not violently, but firmly. Ordinary people, families, teenagers, strangers, closed ranks around Eleanor and Mike, forming a living shield. Their voices became one. Enough is enough. For the first time, the officer seemed small, swallowed by the power of unity, exposed under the bright glare of justice. His authority didn't matter. His badge didn't matter. What mattered was the truth, and the truth was standing right in front of him, in the form of an aging woman who had endured too much, and a legend who refused to let her endure more. Eleanor clung to Mike's arm, whispering through her tears, thank you for not letting me fall." Mike looked down at her gently, then back at the officer with fire in his eyes. "If you ever raise your hand against someone like her again, you'll answer not just to me, but to all of them." He gestured to the roaring crowd. The moment was electric. The officer, sweating and shaken, backed away slowly, his authority shattered, his cruelty laid bare for the entire world to see. In that instant, victory wasn't measured in fists or blows. It was measured in courage, in standing up when it mattered most. And Mike Tyson had just delivered the knockout punch without ever throwing one. When the sirens faded and the officer retreated, the park was no longer a place of fear. It had become a stage of unity. Eleanor sat down on a nearby bench, her cane trembling in her hand. She was exhausted, but her eyes were alive with gratitude. People rushed to her side with water bottles, tissues, and comforting words. Children offered her back the bruised apples that had rolled across the ground. Mike Tyson stood guard beside her, his towering frame radiating both strength and calm. For a man once feared for his fists, this was a different kind of fight, and perhaps the most important of his life. He wasn't in the ring, but he was still protecting the vulnerable. Eleanor's voice was soft, but it carried across the hushed crowd. "He would have broken me, but you didn't let him." Tears streamed down her cheeks. Mike shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. I just did what was right. What anyone should have done." By the time Eleanor was safely escorted home, the videos had already spread across the internet. Millions watched in outrage and awe. Clips filled every social media feed. A uniformed officer brutalizing a grandmother, and a world-famous boxer stepping in to save her. Hashtags trended overnight. Protests swelled in cities far away. For many, this wasn't just a story. It was proof of what they had always known but rarely seen so clearly. Unchecked power can be stopped when courage stands up to it. News anchors replayed the footage on loop. Some called Tyson a hero. Others questioned how an officer could justify such violence. Politicians scrambled to respond. Investigations were launched. But beyond the noise of headlines and hashtags, the real impact was quieter and deeper. People who had always stood on the sidelines began to ask themselves what they would do if they saw the same thing. Could they stay silent anymore? Or would they finally step forward, even if they weren't Mike Tyson? For Eleanor, life returned to its slow rhythm, but she was never the same. Strangers visited her home to thank her for her strength. Letters poured in, calling her a symbol of dignity. She had lived long enough to see both cruelty and kindness, and she knew now, more than ever, that the fight for respect never truly ends. For Mike, the moment became part of his legacy. Not a championship belt, not a highlight reel knockout, but an act of raw humanity. He showed the world that true power isn't about domination, it's about protection. As the sun set on that fateful day, the image remained. A frail old woman gripping her cane, standing beside a legend who had shielded her, with a crowd united in defiance around them. And it left behind a question, echoing louder than any punch ever thrown. If one man can stand up against injustice, what's stopping the rest of us?